Jaycee Wendell is currently the Suicide Prevention Specialist at the Mental Health Association in Delaware, MHA. Versatile, they have also served as a community educator, website and communications associate, and intern at MHA. In their current role, they coordinate in the organization's suicide prevention efforts, including chairing the Higher Education Suicide Prevention Subcommittee and co-chairing the Delaware Suicide Prevention Coalition. Jaycee is a certified trainer for mental health, first aid, applied suicide intervention skills training and question, persuade, refer for adults, and they also provide lifelines prevention for youth. In addition to working in the mental health field, they are active in LGBTQ+ advocacy, including previously being a program coordinator for AIDS Delaware's The Village Youth Leadership Team. They graduated cum laude from the University of Delaware with dual degrees in Human Services, Clinical Concentration in Sociology in 2021, and are currently pursuing their master's in social work at University of Maryland, Baltimore. Jaycee is passionate about advocacy, social issues, and human rights, especially for the LGBTQ+ and disability communities. In their free time, Jaycee likes to be creative, go on adventures, and explore nature.
Welcome to De-Stress 302. I am Alena, and we are here with
Jaycee.
All right. Would you like to start by telling us a little about your intersecting identities and mental health journey?
Sure. So a little bit about myself is that, first and foremost, I have a lot of intersecting identities that really define who I am, right? So I'm disabled, I'm queer, I'm transgender, I'm neurodivergent. I have a lot of mental health challenges, including suicidal ideations. And so all of those things, all of those identities really influence the way that I navigate through life, and also, influences the work that I do, right? Because I currently work in the mental health field. It influences the way I interact with people on a daily basis. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Mm-hmm. And what inspired you to get into this line of work?
Yeah, so what inspired me to get into the mental health field in particular is because throughout my entire life, I've struggled with my mental health, right? And unfortunately did not receive the supports that I needed growing up. And eventually, what was really monumental in my life is it got to the point of when I was a sophomore in college, I was really struggling with my mental health. And it was the worst time period in terms of my suicidal ideations. I had an active suicide plan, was not doing good, right? And thankfully, during that time period, I did do an inpatient hospital stay. And because of that hospital stay, I realized that there's a greater need for people out there to be in the field to help others who are struggling, right? No one should ever have to reach to that point of needing a hospital stay or wanting to actively end their life, right? So I wanted to be that person for somebody else to support them, help them find resources before they get to that same point that I was in. So that was really what turned my life around. After that hospital stay, I realized, okay, now I know what I want to do with my career, and that is to work in the mental health field so that others don't feel as alone as I did navigating my journey without the supports that I needed.
Yeah, for sure. I noticed your tattoos. I really like them. And would you like to talk about the symbolism that they've had for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So this tattoo, which is of a heartbeat, that tattoo I actually just got after my inpatient hospital stay because I wanted something to symbolize, hey, I made it, right? And essentially what it symbolizes is that if I made it through my hardest days and my heart is still beating, I can make it through today, right? If today is a really bad day, I'm still here, right? I can make it through today. Nothing will compare to that time period in my life when I was really struggling. So whenever I'm really struggling, I look down at that tattoo and I'm like, you know what? I'm strong, I'm resilient, right? I don't necessarily, I shouldn't have to be resilient, but I am, right? Mm-hmm. So that is definitely one of the tattoos that I look at frequently. I have quite a few others. A lot of them are related to nature, and I'm very connected with nature because with nature we think about growth, right? And I think that's really powerful to think about. We as human beings, we also have that capability of growing. Like what happened in the past doesn't define us now, right? So that's a little bit about my tattoos.
Yeah. I especially really like what you said about you shouldn't have to be resilient, but you are. That really struck with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how has being a part of the LGBTQ community affected your perspective on mental health?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think being a part of the LGBTQ plus community really taught me the importance of community, right? And when I say community, I'm more so talking about like having a chosen family, because unfortunately, not every LGBTQ plus individual is able to, be a part of their biological family, right? Or the family that they grew up with. So I think it's really important to be a part of a community where you feel like you have a sense of being, where you feel like you belong, where people accept you no matter what, right? There are no expectations of how you should show up, right? Or how you should act or how you should present, because unfortunately, in the LGBTQ plus community, there are high rates of isolations, right? There are high rates of mental health challenges, suicide included, right? So I can provide some statistics if that would help create like a bigger picture. So I brought some statistics with me, but if we focus on LGBTQ plus youth in particular, the Trevor Project, first of all, they're a great organization. Every year they do a survey. So in 2024, what they found is that 39% of LGBTQ plus youth have seriously considered attempting suicide. And when we look into transgender non-binary individuals, 46% of those individuals consider attempting suicide. And then out of those statistics, right, more than 1 in 10 LGBTQ plus youth actually attempted, right? And I think that really highlights the struggles that LGBTQ plus youth go through, right? With that isolation of no one cares about me, I feel like I don't belong, right? If we look into LGBTQ plus adults in particular, LGBTQ plus adults, they are more than twice as likely as heterosexual counterparts, and also transgender LGBTQ plus adults, they are more than 4 times as likely than cisgender counterparts to develop a mental health condition. So again, really highlights how this community, they have high risk, right? They're very vulnerable. So they really need a community to rely on others, right? Because that is hard, being part of the community, navigating by yourself, you need to be able to rely on others as well. Be like, I'm really struggling, can you help me out? So that's what I have for your question.
Mm-hmm. On a similar note, many parents may not be fully prepared or understanding of their child with, if they're disabled, neurodivergent, or part of the LGBTQ community. What advice or encouragement would you give to those parents?
Yeah, so I would say take the time, energy, and effort to really devote to doing research on that identity or condition or disability that the child has, right? And when I say research, what I mean is listen to the community that they are a part of, right? You don't want to focus too much on what society says, right? You don't want to focus on ableist standards or cisnormative standards or heteronormative standards, for example, right? You want to listen to the actual community itself, right? And so the reason why that's so important, right, is because the individuals who belong in those communities themselves, they know best, right? They have lived the experience, they've gone through the experiences of what it means to be disabled or queer or transgender, right? So they are the experts. So as a parent, that would be the best way to navigate that, right, is to listen to the experts who have those lived experiences, listen to the advice that they have. How do I raise this child to make sure that they are loved, nourished, that they are supported?
What's something you wish more people understood about disability?
Disabled people are far more capable than you think, right, or believe. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misconceptions that disabled people are far less capable, right? And a lot of that comes down to the medical model versus the social model of disability. And for those who don't know what that means, the medical model of disability essentially it implies that individuals are like their deficits are because of their individual disability, right? It's because of the individual of why they are having these deficits, right? It's their faults, if that makes sense. Whereas the social model recognizes that the individual is disabled because of society, because the society does not accommodate for the individual. So, for example, wheelchair users, right? The medical model would say the individual can't get around because they're disabled, whereas the social model would say they can't get around because it is not at every place that you'll find a ramp, right? If we lived in a world where there were ramps built everywhere, then it wouldn't be considered a deficit for wheelchair users to get around over ramps and over curbs, right? So it is really important to think about it is important to remember if you are noticing that you have these biases come up when you're interacting with a disabled individual of believing that they're less than, right? Think about what are the societal messages that you have learned that have been socialized growing up, right? And think about the person that you're talking to, right? They're a human being. They're not necessarily defined by their disability. Yes, they will have a lot of challenges, right? A lot of struggles because of their disability, but they're not just their disability, right? They're also a human being who can also experience joy, who can also experience, happiness, all of these things, right? They're not less than, they're not capable of living life to the fullest, right? They are, right? So you want to counteract all of those messages that you may have received growing up.
Yeah. Would you tell us about the connections between neurodiversity and mental health or even suicidal ideation?
Yeah, absolutely. So individuals who are neurodivergent, they are more likely to develop mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, right? They are also more likely to develop suicidal ideations, right? Because if you think about it, for example, for neurodivergent individuals, they are trying to navigate a neurotypical world, which can be quite stressful, right? Because you're constantly on guard trying to figure out how do I interact with others? How am I supposed to act? It adds a lot of stressors. And then on top of that, facing discrimination, right? Such as having a difficulty finding a job that is accommodating, right? That is understanding of what it means to, for example, have an autistic individual on the staff, right? So it can be really challenging. And I'm like forgetting the question. Can you remind me again?
The connections between neurodiversity and the mental health aspect.
Thank you for the reminder. And so when you think about the set of challenges that they run into often, right, that can take a toll on their mental health, right? So that is one thing to keep in mind. The other interesting relationship that happens between neurodiversity and also mental health is that oftentimes neurodivergent individuals, especially autistic individuals, they can go through a long period without realizing or being diagnosed with autism, because what ends up happening is often those individuals are diagnosed with like depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, like a myriad of like a huge list of mental health issues or challenges before they finally get diagnosed with autism. That explains, oh, that's why I was feeling depressed or anxious all the time. And that actually happened in my case because I'm a late diagnosed autistic individual. I didn't get diagnosed until earlier this year. So I lived throughout my entire life of all of my challenges being attributed to all of my other mental health challenges, but some of those ended up being, it's because I'm also neurodivergent, but I was undiagnosed. So that's another interesting relationship to think about as well.
For viewers who may be even like considering like, oh, maybe I'm neurodivergent, or, they think that, but they might have their doubts or they're sort of confused on where to take that. What is your advice on like how to get a diagnosis or like what steps to take?
Yeah, absolutely. So one is definitely do research, right? And one great way to do research is to find online communities. I myself found myself gravitating towards using Reddit because it was such a great resource for listening to others' lived experiences of what it means to be neurodivergent, right? What it means to be neurodivergent and disabled, for example, because there are some intersections there happening. So listening to those who have already gone through the experience of being diagnosed or navigating what it means exactly, and also, recognizing that unfortunately not everybody has the privilege to get diagnosed. And the reason why I say that is that, especially in the neurodivergent community, it's important to know that self-diagnosing can be just as valid. And I know that can be a little controversial where sometimes people may say, but you need to see a professional. But the reality is, especially as an adult, it's really difficult to get diagnosed with autism or ADHD, right? So there are cases where individuals do have those conditions, but unfortunately they're not able to find a professional that is, within insurance coverage or within driving distance to get diagnosed, right? And so that is one thing that can be really important to keep in mind, that if you're not able to formally get diagnosed, it's okay, right? Because you can still utilize the information out there to figure out what accommodations do I need, right? So yeah, that's what I have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, especially for myself, I relate a lot to that. I don't have a formal diagnosis, but I did about 8 or 9 months of research just last year to sort of get a better understanding of ways to sort of, like I said, mainly just to understanding myself and these sort of symptoms are connected to this, but I might not be able to fully identify with it without a formal diagnosis myself. So I also feel really encouraged by sort of what you said about the validity of self-diagnosing with a lot of research. And I know a lot of my own friends as well are neurodivergent diagnosed, and peer review is also a thing.
Yeah, definitely peer review, because I was talking to one of my friends about, I want to say 2 years ago, and I mentioned to her, I was like, I think I might be autistic, but I'm not sure. And she was like, well, it takes one to know one, and I think you are. And I was like, that's peer review right there. So that's definitely another great thing to do, is talk to individuals in real life. Like if you already have friends who are neurodivergent, oftentimes they'll be able to help you figure that out. So definitely you can rely on others for that.
Yeah, for sure. It's a real comfort to sort of have that community and
absolutely
be encouraged in that way.
Yeah.
Why is, and sort of switching over a little bit more to the mental health itself, why is raising awareness about suicide prevention so important these days?
Yeah, it is so crucial, because there are a lot of people out there who are struggling in the dark, right? Because when we talk about suicide, there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of misinformation, right? And I think oftentimes individuals who are really struggling, they face this societal pressure to be strong, right? I can't show weakness. I can't let others know what is really going on in my head, the battlefield that I'm going through every single day, right? But it is so important to talk about it, to raise awareness, because, for example, when we look at statistics, they are alarmingly high, really concerning, right? So, for example, if you look at ages 10 to 25, it's the third leading cause of death, right? And that is far too high. When you specifically look into ages 10 to 14, it is the second leading cause of death, right? No child should be thinking about suicide, and nobody, regardless of their age, should also be thinking about suicide. But unfortunately, that's reality. And unfortunately, it's also reality that we are noticing these numbers are increasing, right? More than ever, people are experiencing isolation. And I think a huge part of that is technology, right? Where technology can be a great tool for connecting to others, absolutely. But I think sometimes it's used to replace that important face-to-face interaction that we desperately need, right? So I think more than ever, we need a lot of awareness. We need to talk about it, because if we don't talk about it, it's still happening. It's just happening in the dark, right?
What common misconceptions do people often have about suicide?
Yeah. So some common misconceptions would be that individuals with thoughts of suicide, they are weak, right? Or they're being selfish, or, they can just get out of it. You know what I mean? In terms of like, if they just go outside, it'll get better, right? But the reality is that suicide is complicated, right? Having thoughts of suicide is complicated as well, right? Suicide is not the problem, but rather is perceived as a solution to a problem, right? So when we want to help an individual having thoughts of suicide, we have to recognize that it's not just the thoughts of suicide that's happening, it's something else is happening underneath the surface. And usually that has to do with feeling disempowered, right? Feeling like they have a sense of loss, right? They don't have control over what is happening in their life, right? Or they're in so much pain, right? And so it is really crucial to support these individuals and recognize that they're strong, right? They're not weak, they're strong actually, because it can be really heavy to carry those thoughts day after day, and still make the decision to be alive, right? That can be a lot. That can take a toll on someone's mental health. And then also going back to the stigma or misconception that, they're selfish. If anything, they're being selfless because they're thinking about others when they are formulating their suicide plan of, I don't want others to go through the pain that I'm going. Like, I don't want to put others through pain, right? They're thinking about others when it comes to, they would be better off without me, right? Like they usually center their decision around others. And so they are trying to calculate, the cost benefit of going through a plan. And so those are just some common misconceptions that I wanted to point out.
Mm-hmm. Regarding the stigma, last week you were talking about sort of the wording and the terminology used regarding suicide, like term committed and a failed versus successful attempt. Would you like to sort of talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things, right? So often people will say they committed suicide, right? And often when we use the word commit, we're often talking about committed a sin or committed a crime. So it has a very negative connotation. And with the conversation about suicide, already there's a lot of stigma, right? So we're trying to reduce the stigma as much as possible. And part of that is changing the language, right? So instead of saying they committed suicide, instead saying they died by suicide or they ended their own life, right? It's a much more neutral way to say it, right? Suicide in itself inherently is not neutral, right? It's going to be very activating to talk about. But in terms of like the standpoint of language, we can try to be more neutral about it, right? The other thing is often you'll hear people say successful suicide attempt or failed suicide attempt. And when we use those adjectives, essentially we're trying to imply that it's something you want to be good at, something you want to be successful at or strive for. And that's not what we're trying to say, or that's not something we should try to imply, right? So instead just be more neutral of they attempted to take their life or they died by suicide, right? So language is really important, right? So for those who are listening, definitely I encourage you to consider the language that you are using when you talk about suicide and, also consider, is there anything that you could potentially change so that it becomes more neutralized and not as stigmatizing?
What are the best resources for youth dealing with these struggles? And this can be suicidal ideation, neurodivergency, isolation, anyone a part of the LGBTQ community as well, just any sort of youth dealing with all of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. So some more like formal supports or resources come to mind, and that does include, for example, the 988 Suicide Crisis Lifeline, right, as well as the Crisis Text Line. Both of those resources are great because they're 24/7. They're very accessible in terms of they're free, right? they connect youth to a trained professional who is able to talk that youth through whatever they're going through, right? And they don't have to be in a crisis, right? Where if they just had a really bad day, right, they can talk to these individuals on the phone, right, or by text. So it's not just for crisis. And I think sometimes people get confused about that, right? But there's also a common stigma or fear that I want to point out that often youth are afraid to use these resources because they're afraid that, for example, 911 is going to be called if they contact 988, right? But that is typically not the case unless they express some type of desire to hurt themselves or others, especially by suicide. Another great resource would be the Trevor Project that is specifically for LGBTQ plus youth. Very similar to 988 and the crisis text line in terms of they do have that resource for LGBT I'm getting tongue-tied, but for queer youth, right, to talk to someone, right, to connect with someone. But also there's a lot of informal resources out there, right, including, if your school has some type of, student club where students with common identities can connect, they can do so, right? Or if your school doesn't already have those clubs, seeing if you're able to advocate and start a club, right? If your school is limited in that regard where you're not able to have those types of student clubs, at least try to develop a group outside of school where, you meet once a month, for example, like a social club, if you will, that's not associated with school. That could be an option as well.
Yeah, and I like your mentioning of the clubs because the community is such a big part of, who we are, and the creators of this podcast. We're just such advocates for community and getting connected, and especially with young adults and teens. And it is probably one of the biggest things and repeated themes that I have heard from a lot of different professionals talking about sort of what the best ways to manage mental health is, the community, just nail in that sort of effect. So previously, you had talked about Kevin Hines and the Golden Gate Bridge story. Would you like to sort of retell that and sort of the significance of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Kevin Hines is an individual that I like to talk about frequently because I find his story very profound and very impactful. So Kevin Hines, he was 19 years old when he jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, which is a common location for people to attempt suicide, and oftentimes they will die by suicide because it's quite deadly, right? But for Kevin Hines, he survived his suicide attempt from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And ever since then, he became a strong mental health advocate, right? Where he now talks about his story. And one thing about his story that really stands out to me is the fact that when he jumped off the bridge, it was instant regret. And in this one particular YouTube video that I often show to others when I do presentations and trainings about suicide prevention, he'll mention that the other survivors, jump survivors, have all also felt the same thing, which was instant regret. So it goes back to this notion that most individuals with thoughts of suicide, they don't really want to die. It's more so they want their pain to end. And they don't know how else to end their pain other than to end their life. And I think when Kevin Hines shares his story, I think it's a perfect example of demonstrating that most people don't really want to die, right? And I think it's so powerful, and I think it can be really helpful for people who are considering suicide to hear that, like that instant regret part. Because I know, at least for me personally, because I do have chronic passive suicidal ideations, whenever I see that YouTube video of him saying instant regret, it always sends chills down my spine, right? And it is one of the things that prevent me from seriously considering it and moving forward. So I think it can be really powerful in that way of helping others who are also struggling to hear that story and be like, oh, like, okay, that helps me better understand. Maybe it's not so much that I want to die, it's just I'm having a lot of pain and I need some help, you know?
The mention of just like the instant regret, it reminds me of a poem, The View from Halfway Down. It was written for a TV show, but like I think that
BoJack
it's still
Horseman, yeah.
really relevant. And I forget who wrote it, but if you look it up, I think you'll be able to find it. And I really encourage like the listeners to read it. And like that was a huge impact on me when I had seen it. And just the sort of the view from halfway down being about how you regret not just the sort of the regretting the action, and you're not really thinking about that regret until you're halfway down. And it was such a, like I said, like just such a huge impact. And then I really recommend the poem. And there are also other like sort of arts and music that I've listened to and seen that's really impacted a lot of like how to communicate just mental health. I mean, I've listened to a lot of like 21 Pilots, Ren, and I've seen a lot of art on just like my For You page. I mean, it's not really hard to find, I think, and that sort of connection that I have to that is a really big part of my mental health journey as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, media can be a huge part of your recovery journey in terms of listening to poems, because I am familiar with that poem. I also did see that episode, and it also really resonated with me. I'm pretty sure I like cried like watching that episode. I was like, but also listening to songs, watching TV shows or movies, right? That really kind of hits you in the gut of like, oh, that's like how I'm feeling today, right? Because sometimes individuals, they struggle with expressing their emotions, right? Or really understanding what exactly they're feeling, right? So being able to access those things, right? Being able to listen to a song, for example, can really help you release those emotions in a healthy way, right? So definitely thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. All right. Do you have any closing advice you would like to give to the listeners?
Ooh, closing advice. That's a good question. I think just, it's okay to not be okay, right? But it's not okay to struggle alone, right? Rely on others, rely on your support system. It can be pretty heavy to struggle with mental health challenges all alone, right? Trying to figure it out, because I've tried and it didn't work out very well, right? It's not sustainable to struggle for so long and not utilize resources or talk to others that can help you realize that you are not the only one struggling, right? Which can be really reassuring of today was a really bad day. But I also know that one of my friends also had a really bad day. So, we'll talk together and we'll feel better, right? So I think that is definitely one thing that is really helpful. And also just reminding ourselves of our value and worth, that we are deserving of recovery and well-being, right? Because I think sometimes individuals, they reach a point where they feel like, what's the point of even trying? I'm never going to get better, or I don't deserve to get better because of X, Y, and Z, all of the things I've done in the past, right? But no matter your background or what you did in the past or what you're struggling with, you are still deserving of recovery, happiness, well-being, right? You are still deserving of being connected in a community that cherishes and loves and support you for who you are. So,
all right. Thank you so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure to have you on the podcast here. And viewers, stay tuned.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. De-Stress 302 is a Cause of the World production. This program was produced by members of the Cause production crew. Crew includes Milan Wood, Alana Hernandez. Associate producers are Adam Hubert and Alena Duggan. Produced by Matt Kelly. Our executive producers are Hayat Omar and Dennis Finicaro. This show was brought to you by the 988 Lifeline in Delaware and the Cause. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, alcohol or drug use, is in emotional distress, or just needs someone to talk to, contact 988. 988's trained, caring counselors are ready to listen. Call, text, or chat 988 for free and confidential support, 24/7, 365. You are not alone. Subscribe to De-Stress 302 today.